Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Sci-Fi. I've been in Los Angeles this week, which has been great, so we've got some really exciting episodes coming up. Please consider the Patreon channel, which is a link in the description. We now have B-sides and audio-only versions of everything for the patrons, so thanks so much for you guys that are already supporting us, it's really great. Coming up soon, Mary Ruti, which was requested by viewers and stuff, and that was great, really happy to be able to do that. And Julian Fields from the QAnon Anonymous podcast. That's quite a spicy one on conspiracy theory and QAnon, so that's coming up soon as well. This week it was great to be in Los Angeles, and I joined Sean McDonald in this episode, who's a practicing Lacanian Freudian psychotherapist, to talk about really the relationship between the economy and economics and material conditions and therapy. He's a fascinating guy who had two careers, one as an accountant and one as a psychoanalyst, so in a really unique position to think about the economy and its relationship to therapy. I hope you enjoy the episodes as much as I enjoyed talking to Sean, and thanks so much for listening, everyone. Yeah, great. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. In LA here, it's very nice. In Sean McDonald's apartment. Is Sean McDonald's correct pronunciation, right?
Just like the burgers.
Just like the burgers. And I'm going to talk about, your work as a practitioner, I guess, clinical psychoanalysis, but also your approaches, influences, what they came from. And I guess I'm going to ask some questions about what role psychoanalysis plays today and whether you've seen like any changes and shifts in your kind of career and as capitalism has changed and as the contemporary moment and political moments have changed, whether that's been at all kind of reflected in your practice. But let's just start with like your own story, like where did you train and what kind of approach do you take to psychoanalysis yourself?
I trained in Dublin. I did my master's in University College Dublin. I trained with a chap called Rick Luce, who works a lot with addiction. I started to work in addiction. I was previously an accountant, believe it or not.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, in my prior life. And I did a degree in psychology at night. As part of that degree, I did like an undergraduate, I guess you'd call it, a minor here. Mm-hmm. I did a minor in psychoanalysis, and I was not a big believer in psychoanalysis at the time, but I had a lecturer called Rick Luce, who's a Dutch fellow who practices in Dublin, and just the way he articulated what the theory of Freud and then obviously Lacan, it really struck me as something it made sense to me. Right? Mm-hmm. The way they explain the human condition. So that's what really got me turned on to it. So that was around 2007? No, 2004, I beg your pardon. Mm-hmm. 2003, 2004. And then from then I just continued my studies, and then I started working in a drug treatment centre in Dublin, and I had a small private practice then when I qualified. And then I came to Los Angeles in 2013.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, let's go to that first bit then. You almost implied you were sceptical of psychoanalysis or something.
Extremely, yes.
Extremely, right. So tell us like that. Why were you sceptical, and what was it about Freud and Lacan as it was taught to you that made you think, okay, this is something I want to be doing?
Well, why I was sceptical of it was, I guess, because I had seen certain representations of it in contemporary culture, or videos or movies or whatever it would be, right? And they were very kind of simplistic, and they didn't really strike me as true. And I thought that they were just too easy explanation, right? And as I began to study, and as Rick explained it in his lectures and other lectures there too, I understood that it was a lot more complex than that. Mm-hmm. And his ideas around language also interested me very much, particularly Lacan's and Freud's to an extent, of course, because he was really interested in language himself, although he didn't really articulate that as such in his work, in the direct way that Lacan did. But the way that they spoke about language, because I've always been interested in writing, and I was a bit of a voracious reader when I was younger, so just the way they talked about language and the formation of the subject, it made sense to me.
Yeah.
It's hard to put like a finger on it. There's I think Freud wrote an article called The Sense of Symptoms. It's in I think it's one of the meta-psychological papers or the technique papers, I think they're called. I'm sorry. And to me, it made sense because the way he wrote about it, the symptoms do have a sense, right? So you have a way of kind of uncovering them, you have a way of kind of, I think Freud said, you just dust away, like an archaeologist, they just use a little brush and they dust away, and then it comes into, the picture comes to light, right? What's hidden comes up. And that just made a lot of sense to me. I think perhaps looking back on it, I was resistant to this idea, this Freudian idea, right? That we're all a bit messed up. And, a lot of it is to do with our family, and not necessarily anything one person in particular did, but just how we were in the family, the dynamics of the family, and things that were said to us, perhaps.
And
how they're very formative for us.
So, I mean, that's really interesting. I totally agree. It was the same for me, really. I mean, like you, I was taught Freud and Lacan by one particularly inspired. I mean, as I said to you before, much more on the sort of theory history. I've never done practical training in any kind of psychotherapy, but again, it was one individual who taught me those things and made it visible to me how this made sense to me, and started to sort of structure how I would then perceive the world and so on. So I think that's really interesting to hear. And I suppose what I want to fascinate to ask you is, like, since this point, and so you have the training, you read Freud and Lacan, you come to a point eventually of thinking this stuff makes sense, this vision of subjectivity, whether that might be, whether that's a lacking subject, whatever that you've talked about before and so on, or Freudian concepts, they make sense to you. How does that then, obviously you're not asking about individual cases or anything, but as then a practitioner in the room with subjects, do these Lacanian Freudian models explain all these subjects, or do you find only some people, these concepts from Freud and Lacan are only sometimes useful in the actual process of therapy itself?
I think that they can explain mostly all people. What I think happens, though, is that people don't want things to be explained to them in that way, or they're not interested, or they're there for, I've got this problem, I want you to fix that. And so it's much more action based on that one thing. And so they don't want these things to be explicated or explored. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not there. But I think also that some people do want it to be explored. But you also have to remember when you're practicing, well, I do anyway, is that Freud said that the unconscious kind of, the moment it appears, it retreats, right? So it comes in little flashes. And it's not really something that you can really examine, like from the start of a session to the end of a session, right? It comes up and it leads to other things. Like dreams, for example, people are, in my experience, a lot of people don't remember their dreams initially. When you say, do you dream? Like, have you been dreaming? They go, I don't dream, or I don't remember my dreams. Or yeah, but they're nothing, or whatever. And so obviously the more you talk about them, it's like a bit of a muscle memory thing. They start to talk about them more. But what Freud said about dreams was, he said they are the royal road to the unconscious activities of the mind, right? So it's about the activities of the mind. So it's this idea of association, word association. It's not that they're the royal road to the unconscious. They're the royal road to the unconscious activities of the mind, which is quite different. And that's what I would say is effective in the work, in clinical work, is to remember that it's what's the right term for it? There are little bursts where the unconscious comes up. And they can be worked on and analysed. But you're not working, it's not something that you uncover like a cake and go, oh, here it is, let's talk about this thing all day. Because it's by its nature, by its definition, it's hidden, it's unconscious, right? So we can never really know it in that sense. We just talk around us.
Yes. Okay. I mean, that's really interesting. Is it more, I mean, so correct me if I'm understanding this correctly or not. Is it that it's not so much the dream, for example, that is important, but the way in which it's described by the patient or analyzer.
And the way it's associated to. So, it's not necessarily a dream, it's the associations that come from the telling of the dream. And you move away, well, in my work, generally, you move away from the dream quite quickly and you go to other things.
Yes,
The subject begins to talk about other things because they're associating, right?
Yes.
So the dream is like a little springboard, and off we go.
And perhaps the same for, you mentioned before, the concept of family. These are two things, aren't they, that you've already mentioned that, people...
I dream of a family.
Yeah, right, but when people think of the stereotypical Freud, it's all about the family, or it's all about sex, or it's all about dreams. These are probably your three things that come up the most commonly in cliche Freud.
Right,
But would these all fit into this category, perhaps, that it's not so much about the clues are to be found in these three things, but in the speaking, in the use of language to describe these things are revealed, and then association begins. So are these all three sort of jumping off points to get the subject speaking?
The families, dreams and sex.
Those are the three I went for.
Yeah. Well, yeah, essentially. I mean, yes, because what tends to happen again, and this is anecdotal, it doesn't happen with everybody, is that the more people talk about things, the more they remember. So the more people talk about their experiences of their family or when they were young, which necessarily includes experiences with their family, then the more that they recall and the more they remember, okay? And there are things that happen outside of sessions or between sessions that jolt a subject to remember something, and then they bring it in. But that happens during the course of the work. Yeah. So not initially probably, but like a year in or whatever it may be. Yeah. They'll start to bring material, right?
Yeah, because the process has, No, I mean, I guess as you were saying that, I was thinking about like Freud's Dora case and how this works. It's not so much, it ends up not being that the incident itself, or whatever, the kiss with the guy, the uncle kind of figure, turns out not to be the most important incident itself, but the way she tells the story, like, triggers this association thing, which allows him to then work out what's going on with the subject or something. I wondered if it was something like that.
To work out, are you talking, what came into my head when you spoke was like this idea of signifiers and Lacan's idea of signifiers, right? So these associations are essentially words, or they're described in words. And these words, Lacan will call them signifiers, okay? Yeah. Again, for me, the signifiers are like links in a chain. They do lead somewhere. They tell a story. They tell a story about a subject's life that the subject is not necessarily aware of when they're telling it. Yeah. Right? And it takes a long time for different signifiers to come out. And sometimes because in America, well, this part of America and in my experience here, the analysis or the work of analytic, I don't really consider myself a pure psychoanalyst because I'm not, I haven't done the pass and, I haven't, traversed the fantasy and all that jazz, right? Because I'm not awfully sure what it means. I think I've traversed the fantasy in other ways in my life, but so I work in I kind of sneak it in. Like it's a theoretical framework for the way I work. But it's not something I explicitly talk to people about. Like, if you come to see me, I'm not going to say, this is what we're going to do. It's Freudian, Lacanian, blah, 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 blah. I say, this is what we're going to talk about. Like, maybe we'll talk about your dreams and that kind of thing. But it's quite an open way I approach things.
Well, I was going to ask about that, actually. Kind of accidentally skipped that stage, because we jumped into all that. But
yes.
But, I wanted to know about it, because one of the things that interests me there is, a lot of the people I've spoke to on this podcast are card-carrying Lacanians in a very, strict sense, right?
Yes.
And I think it's very important to think about outside the box with that. I mean, and sometimes it seems to me like there's almost a kind of psychoanalysis wars going on, like, every type versus every type. And of course, the way I came to, the way I was at, one of the people who introduced me to psychoanalysis is Ian Parker, who kind of used cognitive behavioural therapy to oppose it. So whereas, CBT, for example, might be considered like the get back to work therapy or whatever, like as quickly and efficiently as possible, let's turn you back into a functioning subject that serves capitalism. Whereas for him, Lacanian psychoanalysis could be a very opposite approach, as it were. So I can see why there are forms of therapy which rub up against each other. Maybe that's Anna Freud school versus Lacan, CBT here. So I just wanted to ask you about that, really. And as someone who uses more of a broad range of theoretical and clinical influences, you're not really, you're doing something other than joining in these therapy wars, maybe.
Well, I mean, there's even Lacanian wars. Even in a city like Dublin, I think there's like 5 or 6 Lacanian schools or practices, okay? So, it is something that really divides people, which is interesting because we talk about the divided subject, but it divides people, like even Lacanian analysis. I mean, and I think that's part of its vibrancy and also part of the problem with it, right? But again, this is what you're talking about when you're talking about the subject is there's a positive and a negative aspect to that, right? So I think Lacanian theory does that because it's so complex, and because when you have to assume your own understanding of it, and then you got to articulate your understanding of it, okay? And that necessarily means that mine will be different to yours, even though the words that we read are the same.
Yeah.
Right? So that's also to do with, when you think about that clinically, that's everybody comes at their own story in a different way. Everyone tells their story differently, right? And it's very specific to them. And then you go back to the signifiers and the words they use, and that becomes informative. So in a way, I'm describing something that kind of reinforces itself in a way, which, again, when I think about Lacanian stuff, I don't know if that's accurate, right? Because for a Lacan, there always has to be a lack, right?
Yes.
For that type of psychoanalysis, there has to be a lack, and one's life it revolves around this lack.
Yes.
For a lot of the other therapies like CBT and stuff like that, the lack is not thought about. It's like, this is what needs to happen. You need to just balance out your thinking in regard to this particular aspect of your life, which is helpful for people, right?
Yeah.
If they have a problem, they go and see somebody, it helps.
Yeah.
Good. Okay? And that's fine for them. I do think you're right, though. If you kind of dive deep into Lacan, then you can't look at the world the same way again.
Yeah.
So it does alter your view of the world. Yeah.
I see.
For sure.
So although you're influenced by other practices, it does have, the whole thing is influenced by your way of thinking has been influenced by a Lacanian approach in a sense.
Well, that's what I am. That's what I do, right? But I understand that not everyone is interested in it, and not everyone comes to you for that.
Yeah.
Right? They come to you just to not feel as bad.
Yeah. Well, not feel bad. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, no, well, let's talk about that question of lack and so on that you just sort of came to there, because I think this is and I'm sure we're up to a certain point like on the same page with this kind of idea. It's also been formative for me, like the getting the subject to recognise that it's kind of constituted by lack fundamentally. So it's a lack that you form at a certain stage in your development, and it's constituted of human subjectivity. So you're necessarily lacking. So whereas lots of society, promises fulfillment, whether that's through marriage and a mortgage, or whether it's through a career, or whether it's through the next iPod or a pair of trainers, there's a promise of fulfillment, which is what Todd McGowan is one person who writes about this kind of thing, which society seems to respond to. But so I suppose I'm thinking though of this, like one could argue, couldn't they? And I think maybe you said this on a really interesting podcast you did with Peter Rollins, that part of the function of psychoanalysis is to get people to see and embrace their existence as a lacking subject, rather than attempting to fill that lack and become whole. Would that be a correct summary of what you think psychoanalysis can do here? And
well, I think that's a correct summary of what psychoanalysis tries to do.
Yeah.
The idea of a lack is an interesting one, because it's not really something that in psychoanalysis, my understanding of psychoanalysis, is not something that you're supposed to bring with you. The lack is something that you have to leave behind. You've got to you have got to traverse that lack, while at the same time accepting that it's there and not trying to fill it, right? That's what moving past the lack entails. Mm-hmm. As far as if you carry it with you, then the iPhone can fill the lack, or the sneakers can fill the lack, right? So if you I don't think carrying it with you is a thing that psychoanalysis or Lacan or Freud or whatever would have said is a good idea.
Yeah.
But this idea of the lack carrying with us is certainly something that's espoused a lot here in Los Angeles, like with these so-called Eastern philosophies and Buddhism and stuff like that they practice here in Los Angeles.
Say more about that. Are you saying there's a similarity between the...
I think perhaps in proper Buddhism, I'm not a Buddhist and I don't know enough about it, but there's a particular kind of form of Buddhism, shall we say. White Buddhism, they call it here, like our
Californian.
Our woo-woo kind of Buddhism, which I think espouses this idea that you can have the lack and bring it with you, and there's more of a completeness. You can reach this idea of completeness, which psychoanalysis is about incompleteness.
Yeah.
It's about accepting incompleteness. It's about accepting not knowing.
Yeah.
If the other is other, then we cannot know it.
Yeah.
And how do we accept that? Right?
And do you
how
think
do we work through the acceptance of that? Because it affects all of our relationships, particularly our love relationships. Because we want that other who is our love to be that thing.
Well, let's talk about that in a quick second, but I just want one follow-up on the question of the California, and so it makes me want to ask, do you think that this completeness and carrying the lack with you is the rhetoric of capitalism, and therefore the psychoanalysis which would resist this has a kind of anti-capitalist dimension then? Would that be a sort of...
Yeah, I would have thought that capitalism complements it, and it complements capitalism.
Yeah.
The two probably go hand in hand. I know that Lacan had a discourse of capitalism. He had like these 4 discourses. Yeah. But I think he had a fifth one.
was going to be the capitalist.
But I think he actually wrote about it, and I think this chap Rick Luce, who in Dublin, I think he speaks about it. He understands it, what it is. But there is this discourse. I just don't know what it is off the top of my head, so I couldn't try to talk about it. But I remember at a talk he spoke about it. But I certainly think, yes, if we don't have the lack and we don't think we can fulfill it, then capitalism kind of falls on its arse. Yeah. Right?
Yes, I think that might be right. But it occurs to me, I do want to, let's come to the love thing in a sec, but I want to have another comment about this. I wondered whether it is good for the subject to accept its nature as lacking. And whether you can, in fact, give up on that. Because another thing that you said, I'll put the link to the discussion that Sean had with Peter Rollins into the description for this, because it's sort of connected to these conversations. But one of the other things you said there is about sort of getting up in the morning, right? Without the lack. I don't know, you told a story about some guy who got rid of his lack and then was extremely bored or something like that.
Right, okay.
This seems really, really important. That you need the lack to get up in the morning, right? Otherwise, desire ends. This is one of the tricks here. If you were fulfilled, you'd have no desire, and you'd essentially wouldn't be a subject. You wouldn't be a desiring subject anymore. There'd be no point in doing anything. Yeah. Right, so in a sense, if you accept you're lacking, right?
Yeah.
What's the point of getting up in the morning? Don't you have to try to build a fantasy that covers lack, that tries to so-called fill lack, even though you know that the subject is fundamentally like. So I guess the way I might put it is, is this right? We have to recognise that we're lacking, and then we have to disavow that and act as if we're still in pursuit of happiness.
And when you say disavow, what does that mean? Completely deny the reality?
Act as if we haven't realised that fact. So, I can sit here on the one, and this is a good way to lead into talking about love. But, for example, I can sit here in the one hand and say to you, over a coffee or whatever, absolutely, we understand Freud and Lacan, we're lacking subjects, and I can accept that in myself. But then, in my love relationships, I still pursue a fantasy of some kind of completeness or wholeness.
Yes.
Because that keeps me going. I know I'm never gonna be whole, but I still have to somehow ignore the fact that I'm always going to be lacking so that I can keep going and building that fantasy, I guess.
Well, I think if you accept that, you're lacking and that the other is unknowable in a certain way or different, radically different, then you can't be fulfilled in the way that you thought you could be before you accepted the lack. So that becomes an impossibility.
Yeah.
Right? And then when something becomes an impossibility, it's like a death, right? You just go, that's the way it is. And then Lacan had this phrase, to have enthusiasm without hope. Right, so I think that's maybe what you're talking about. How does one get up out of bed?
Exactly.
You just be enthusiastic for the day.
Yes, you go after.
Because you can still enjoy things. It's not that like everything becomes grey and monotone. You still enjoy life and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's just that you're not encumbered by. This is my. I don't know if I'm there yet. But what I imagine is that you're not encumbered by these things that. These desires that cause unhappiness as much, right?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. I mean, it just occurs to me to ask more things about the general experience of people. I mean, you're in LA. We mentioned LA and this Californian ideology and so on.
Yes.
What do people come and talk to you mostly about relationships and are they in this trap where they are looking for wholeness and fulfillment in relationships, but struggling with that, or yeah, I mean, just a simple question would be, how often is it relationships that people come and want to talk about? Or how often is it other things?
It's always relationships. And it's always relationships, and it's always about a person's being in the world. And how do I navigate this place? And like feeling like a stranger in the world. Like that's not always about, but it is always about relationships. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, relationships and interpersonal relationships and just the other and dealing with other people is the hardest thing that humans have to do on a daily basis. Because you've got desires, I've got desires, everyone has them, so they're always kind of rubbing up against each other, right? And I have to get somewhere at 9 o'clock and you're in my way and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Right? So, and then you get to more complex relationships, like love relationships, familial relationships, which are extremely deep and, the bond is extremely strong, right? And enduring. And they're much more complicated, but nonetheless, we still want things from them, for sure, and they affect us,
Yeah, okay.
Because, say, for example, if I would do a group, I work in an outpatient program for people, treating people with so-called co-occurring disorders or whatever. So if I do a group and I'm talking about interpersonal relationship skills and how to manage them, people always talk about their loves, their lovers or their family or whatever. Never talk about Johnny in the street, right? It's always about these relationships. These are always the ones that are most problematic, because it's not that hard if we don't know each other I buy a train ticket from you and off I go, right? We don't have that kind of difficulty, right? But if I've known you for 20 or 30 years or we sleep in the same bed, it's very difficult at times. Right?
Yeah. No,
simple things can be quite hard.
Yeah. And so, okay, so I mean, one thing I wanted to get to, and I suppose now is the time to do this, is to think about whether things change. And one of the things that, we could find interesting, when I asked you at first, do these concepts apply to everyone or just some people? I find that really interesting, because on the one hand, we're talking about universal concepts of subjectivity that come from Freud and Lacan, and these are things, for example, we've just been talking about lacking subjectivity. It applies to everyone. It's one of the... It's not like some people are lacking and other people are fulfilled. This is a fundamental characteristic of subjectivity, so it's kind of universal. On the other hand, some of your observations, like, when you mentioned in the podcast that I mentioned before about, one of the things you said was that anxiety seems to be increasing. So other things we've been talking about now are capitalist discourse and how capitalist discourse offers certain senses of promise and fulfillment. And so this is, I think, really the question. To what extent do these things describe universal things that have been true since the day of Freud? And to what extent are you seeing, as a therapist, changes in the structure of people's subjectivity as we go into, I don't know what we want to call this, but contemporary capitalism and consumer culture that you've commented on before? So do these universal ideas from the Freudian and Lacanian school apply in the same way, or do you also perceive a change in the structure of subjectivity as we've progressed?
I don't know if I'd be able to speak on the structure of subjectivity, to be honest with you. I mean, I think what you may be talking about, or what I hear, is like this idea of symptomology is perhaps changing, right? And the symptoms are becoming more what you would call real, right? In Lacanian terms, like anxiety, like the rise of anxiety in young people, is really phenomenal, and it's quite alarming, right? How this has happened and the speed with which it has happened. Okay, because I think 80% of people who present have anxiety or depression as their main issue, right? And anxiety and depression are basically like on a continuum. They're not necessarily different things. They just one arises from the other. But so these are real symptoms. It's not like I'm not getting along with somebody, or I have to open the door 5 times or whatever it is. This is pure anxiety, right? It's like how do the world overwhelms me. Being in the world overwhelms me, right? And to go back to this idea of capitalism and neoliberalism and all this stuff that is, has been kind of whipped up into a frenzy since 2008, and people talking about this stuff, which rightly so, they should talk about it, because, Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan affected the world for decades, right? And their ideas, so they should be spoken about. I think, I can't remember, what Greenspan, I think, said, that worker insecurity is good for the economy, essentially, right? So the idea was to make workers more and more insecure. Yeah. So if you could imagine like a mother and a father working and they have these insecure jobs and they come home and their children are there and this emanates from them, even if it's not explicitly stated, right? This anxiety emanates. Yeah. And they become unsure of their footing in the world. Children do, right? Because they're not in a secure place. Their parents are anxious. Yeah. I'm just speculating, but I would imagine that this is what happens, right? So that's why you would see an increase in this anxiety, I think, particularly in the Western world. Because, I would imagine if you go to, third world places, they might not have as much anxiety because they've got to get up in the morning and do things. Yeah. There's a very real element to that too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I think that's an amazing answer, actually. I'm totally convinced by that. And I just want to add maybe I was thinking that, I haven't studied Lacan's seminars, all of them in as much detail as I'd like to, but one I did do a lot of work on was the seminar on anxiety, and I actually did it through Cormac Gallagher, the Irish translation. So there is now a translation of anxiety.
I believe so, yeah.
Or something, but there wasn't at the time, and it was just unofficial translation. Probably
they're a tough read.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
They're not quite as flowing as like Miller's translations.
But that was a great contribution though to the whole field because people could get free PDFs and
he did great work.
I looked it through that, and one of the things that I always remember from Lacan's seminar on anxiety is that for him anxiety comes first, right? And so you're born anxious, as it were. Anxiety is there, and it's completely unmoored. I think these are some of his terms. So it's not anxious about something; it's anxiety per se. And then, in Freudian terms, when anxiety becomes fear, it's when anxiety becomes attached to an object. So if we're scared of spiders, first we have unplaced anxiety, and then cognitively we deal with this by organising around an object, and this is part of our defensive mechanism, whatever. So but, I was really thinking how interesting that would be, and wonder what you think about this. Like, if everyone has anxiety to begin with, so you're 100% anxious to begin with, and then on the other hand we're saying that people are becoming more anxious. Now, maybe it's that the process of dealing with anxiety is not happening from a young age. So, you
mean like so-called coping skills, or learning how to manage it?
Yeah,
learning how to deal with it.
If you've got security, if you've got family and economic security, less precarity, this allows you to deal with your anxiety and subjectively and sort of deal with it. Whereas if you never get the family, economic, non-precarious structure around you, you keep the anxiety that you were born with and it doesn't get dealt with. Yeah. Do you think that could be right?
Absolutely. And then you would see like a rise in things like ADHD, where like attention just focuses from one thing to another, because that's all I can do. I have to focus on this because I can't look at the space between this and this, because that's anxiety. Yeah. And like even this idea of phobias, like that's what anxiety is. It's circumscribing anxiety into a sign, be it a spider or whatever. Right? Yeah. I can't name this thing, so I'll put it into a spider.
And that would also be why anxiety and depression go together in the way you just described, I think. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's an amazing point to me, because it means that it's economic and material conditions which they have to be, in order for anxiety to be dealt with, you have to have economic and material conditions in a certain to a certain level of sufficiency. And so when the economic and material conditions go below a certain point, anxiety doesn't get dealt with, and so goes up on the graph, as it were.
I would certainly see it contributing big time to it. Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Yeah.
But again, like my understanding or my thinking around economics and the economy and that kind of thing, capitalism or whatever, is that these things weren't really like standards of living and things like that weren't really things like 100 years ago, right? Yeah. Everyone was just kind of getting on with things unless you were in the top 1% or whatever. So maybe it's not that different to nowadays. But I don't think it was like the middle class. There was no such thing as a middle class 100 years ago, right? This was a very brief period in time. You had a middle class from like the 60s, probably late 50s, until it's starting to disappear again, right? Okay, so it's disappearing here in America, the middle class.
Well, I mean, that's
so like it's only 50 years. That's the length of time you have the middle class.
You have the middle class for,
right? Yeah.
I mean, now just to go back to what you said about people in other spaces, not the non-Western world. I think you put it like they aren't thinking about those things because they've got to they've got to get up and do something.
Yeah.
Right? So
it's just been their way of life for so many years.
Whereas here, you're saying there's been developed a kind of...
Well, in a way, it's good because we've had the freedom to think about these things and to question them, right? And to do all that stuff. But then in a way, it's bad because you're tethered to it.
Yeah.
Right? And so
really
when you're not tethered to it, that's where the anxiety comes in, you know? So that's why recessions and, you know, downturns are so anxiety provoking for people, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have that you have that kind of group psychological reaction to it, right? Everyone starts to stop spending. Once somebody starts to talk about a recession, people stop spending, which precipitates a recession, right? Which makes it worse. So, you know, there is a kind of a herd mentality to this too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if that's got anything to do with psychoanalysis, really.
I mean, it has, I think. I mean, that's really, really interesting. I mean, yeah. No, I think that's really, really interesting. And have you? I mean, we'll sort of come to an end soon, but just we should, but it's just really, really interesting to talk more.
I think because I was an accountant and I'm still interested in economics and finance and things like that, because I'm anxious about the world too. So I think I think about those kind of things, the link between these things.
I think that's a very critical for this moment. I mean, I suppose I was going to finish by asking you what you think about the future of psychoanalysis and therapy, because on the one hand, and precisely because I'm seeing, from what you're saying, I'm also seeing, and I haven't had time to think about it properly, but I'm also seeing this connection between economics and the role of therapy, and sort of, it's just very interesting to wonder what kind of direction that would go in. I mean, on the one hand, of course, your recession means anxiety, decline in material conditions, increase in anxiety, more need for therapy. On the other hand, less time to think about therapy and
less money to access it. Yeah.
So what do you see as like happening? And this is the place for it. I mean, we're in LA where you can see visibly this economic downturn resulting in more and more tents, more and more homelessness, you know.
And more for lease signs in buildings. What I would like to say though is, just because it came into my mind when you were talking, was the difference I experienced between a place like Ireland and the US, or like LA in particular. It's such an individualized society here. It's like the differences between Ireland and America are subtle, but they're very, very real. And I don't know if it's the same as, I've never lived in England, in the UK, or in Europe, but my sense is that England and Europe will be more or less the same as Ireland. But America is an individualized society to such an extent that is also an anxiety-provoking thing, right? To be atomized in that way, right? So what was coming into my mind was this idea of iPhones. It's like the age of the I, I to me. It's all about you, right? And when it's all about you, there is no other people, right? And that's a liberating thing, apparently, but it's also...
that's why everyone comes with their relationship problems.
Well, people in Ireland and Europe have relationship problems too.
You
know, in France they have too many lovers and that kind of thing. Well, those are the problems they have. No, I'm only kidding, of course. But I do think that culturally America is slightly different to Europe, and Europe, I think, I may be biased, but it seems to have it has a little bit of a better balance, personally speaking. You know, there's a lot more opportunity here, I think, in the sense, but there is no safety net. It's an unforgiving place.
Risk seems to be seems really characterised by risk. You know, even driving
the US.
Particularly LA. Like, you know, the amount of like short payday loans companies or loans based on cars, houses. You know, it seems to be like high rewards, devastating collapse. Interesting.
But it's part of the culture because you can like file for a Chapter 10 bankruptcy and then you can be back up on your feet in a year or two. So it's actually kind of written into the culture that it's okay to do that. You know?
No, I mean, I think that with this, you know, your previous career in accountancy and current career in therapy, you know, you're in a really unique position to think about. Perhaps this is perhaps the most important question. Like, what is the relationship between economic, you know, whether we're talking about material conditions and anxiety, or whether we're talking about what happens in economic downturns with therapy and so on. This connection between the two things seems to be critical at the moment. It really does.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like so-called neoliberalism is kind of at an end anyway, you know, and I think that the governments are going to start playing a bigger part in how economies are run, and a lot more money. Inevitably, the only way it's going to work is if there is a huge transition in the world toward green energy and, you know, sustainable energy, and all the investment will have to go there, and that can renew all the economies in the world probably, and that will be the next, you know, upswing, I guess, in the economy if they want to take it on, or else they're holding on to older models. And I guess that's an interesting thing for me, because I was born in the 70s, and I've lived my whole life with this idea, neoliberalism. Yeah. And so then to go back to an older way of being, like where it's more kind of state controlled. There's more state control in an economy in a particular country. That's a different way of being for me. Yeah. Right. I'm not used to that. So. But it will be. I think it's something that will be welcomed by a lot of people, but it seems to be the only way to go, because this thing has kind of run out of steam. It's crashing. Yeah, they've sold all the trains, they've sold all the tea in China, they've sold everything, so you can't resell things that have already been sold. You know? No, But I don't know what this has to do with Lacan.
No, it doesn't have to. It doesn't have to. No, this is just the conversation we happen to have.
I mean, you know, I don't know what Lacan's ideology was in terms of like his political ideology, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, he was critical of anti-capitalism and of radical movements in some ways, and part of them in another way. So, but I think it's I think the discussion we've had, it shows that the ideas can be part of anti-capitalist or progressive discourse, even if they weren't necessarily intended to be.
I think once you go through analysis, or once you're kind of interested in Lacan and you read about this kind of stuff and these ways of thinking, then something like neoliberalism is put into question. And the validity of it, and the actual benefit of it, right?
And the benefit of it on the subject.
For sure. So it helps to frame these things, I think, for us. I agree. You know?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Well, no, look, it's been absolutely brilliant talking about this stuff. I think this is fascinating.
Has it been okay?
Brilliant, yeah. Okay. I really, really, really thought about a lot. I didn't expect to think about, and I'm sure like people will be really interested to listen to this lot. So thanks so much for doing it. It's been really, really great.
Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.